They did not fall to invading armies. No walls were breached, no final battles were fought. These civilizations vanished in silence, leaving behind cities without voices and monuments without memory. At first glance, nothing seems dramatic about their end, but that is precisely what makes their disappearance so unsettling. Because the collapse did not begin with chaos, it began quietly. In the routines of daily life, in decisions that seemed harmless, in changes too small to provoke alarm. And by the time the signs became clear, it was already too late. What remains today are fragments, clues buried beneath soil and time, and a question that still echoes across history: how does an entire society simply fade away? Before their disappearance, these civilizations were not fragile. They were structured, organized, and deeply rooted in their environments. Their cities functioned with precision, markets operated on predictable rhythms, families followed traditions passed down through generations, and leaders governed systems that appeared stable. Agriculture sustained the population, trade connected distant regions, and belief systems gave meaning to existence. Life was not perfect, but it was coherent. People woke up each day expecting continuity. There was no sense of imminent collapse, and that illusion of permanence would become one of their greatest vulnerabilities. Daily life moved with a quiet certainty. Farmers tended to their fields, adapting to seasonal cycles they believed they understood. Artisans crafted tools and objects, embedding cultural identity into every detail. Children were raised within predictable boundaries, learning skills and customs that had survived for centuries. There were rituals, celebrations, and routines that reinforced a sense of order. Nothing suggested that these systems were approaching a breaking point, but beneath this surface of stability, subtle changes were already taking hold. Changes so gradual that they were almost impossible to perceive in real time. The first warning signs did not announce themselves as threats. They appeared as minor disruptions. Slight shifts in climate altered growing seasons. Water sources became less reliable, but not enough to trigger panic. Trade routes experienced occasional interruptions, dismissed as temporary setbacks. Food supplies fluctuated, yet never fully collapsed. These were not crises, not yet. They were inconveniences, anomalies, and because they did not immediately threaten survival, they were tolerated. But no one understood what was coming next. As these subtle disruptions accumulated, the systems that once ensured stability began to strain. Agricultural yields became inconsistent. Communities that relied on predictable harvests started to experience uncertainty. In response, leaders attempted to adapt, often by intensifying existing practices rather than rethinking them. Fields were overworked, resources were stretched. Short-term solutions masked long-term consequences. And slowly, the balance that sustained these societies began to erode. But the change was so gradual that it felt almost natural, as if this was simply the way things had always been evolving. Social structures, once cohesive, began to show fractures. Inequality increased as resources became unevenly distributed. Some regions adapted better than others, creating disparities that fueled tension. Trust in leadership started to weaken, not through rebellion, but through quiet doubt. Decisions made at the top no longer produced the expected outcomes. Systems that once felt reliable now seemed unpredictable. Yet there was no single moment of realization, no collective acknowledgement that something fundamental was breaking. Only a growing sense of unease that no one could fully articulate. Environmental pressure intensified in ways that could no longer be ignored. Prolonged droughts, shifting weather patterns, or ecological degradation began to reshape the landscape. Crops failed more frequently. Water became scarce in areas that once thrived. Migration patterns changed as people searched for stability elsewhere. But migration itself introduced new challenges, placing stress on neighboring regions and disrupting established social orders. The system was no longer self-sustaining. It was reacting, adjusting, and slowly unraveling. Leadership faced impossible choices. Adaptation required transformation, but transformation carried risk. Many chose to preserve existing structures, hoping stability would return. Others attempted reforms that came too late or were too limited in scope. Communication between regions weakened, coordination faltered, and responses became fragmented. The collapse did not happen all at once. It spread unevenly, affecting different areas in different ways. Some communities held on longer than others, but the underlying trajectory was the same. Then came the moment when the system could no longer sustain itself. Not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual failure. Cities were abandoned, not overnight, but over years. Infrastructure deteriorated as maintenance became impossible. Trade networks dissolved. Cultural practices faded as populations dispersed. The mechanisms that once held society together simply stopped functioning. And because there was no single catastrophic event, there was no clear end, only a slow disappearance. For those who lived through it, the experience was not defined by a single moment of loss, but by a series of adjustments. Families left their homes in search of survival. Communities fragmented. Knowledge was lost, not through destruction, but through disuse. Traditions that once defined identity became irrelevant in the face of immediate needs. The world they had known did not collapse suddenly. It slipped away, piece by piece, until it no longer existed. What remained were traces, structures reclaimed by nature, artifacts buried beneath layers of time, patterns that historians and archaeologists would later struggle to interpret. Without written records in some cases, or with incomplete accounts in others, the story of these civilizations became fragmented. Their disappearance left behind more questions than answers, and the absence of a clear cause made their fate even more unsettling. In the centuries that followed, new societies would rise in the same regions, often unaware of what had come before. The memory of these lost civilizations did not persist in a continuous narrative. It was interrupted, erased, or transformed into myth, and yet their collapse shaped the conditions for what followed. Landscapes altered by their presence continued to influence those who came after. Their disappearance was not an isolated event, it was part of a larger cycle. Looking back, the most striking aspect of these collapses is not their inevitability but their subtlety. There was no single mistake, no defining failure. Instead, there was a convergence of pressures, each manageable on its own, but overwhelming in combination. The systems that sustained these civilizations were complex, interconnected, and ultimately fragile. And because their decline did not follow a dramatic script, it was difficult to recognize until it was irreversible. Today their silence remains, not as a warning shouted across history, but as a quiet absence, a reminder that collapse does not always arrive with noise and destruction. Sometimes it arrives unnoticed, embedded in the ordinary, disguised as change. And by the time its presence is undeniable, there is nothing left to preserve, only the echoes of what once was, and the unsettling realization that disappearance can be as quiet as it is complete.